How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boil Eye Hobby Time. I never really know what's going to stand out to me when I walk into a hobby store, but it's often something that I've seen countless times before. And this week I saw these two boxes and decided that they should be together. I actually had a completely different build in mind when I woke up on Monday. But sometimes you just gotta change plans when inspiration strikes. Not that the other idea was a bad one. In fact, I'll probably still build it eventually. But when I went to the store to get materials for that, I saw these two boxes, and the final result of this project was just much clearer in my mind's eye. I really enjoy putting together Shatterpoint minis because of their size, which is actually a lot larger scale than the Xenomorphs that make up the rest of this scene. Maybe some of you are already prepared to leave your comments in the comment section about that discrepancy. But I'm not really bothered by the difference because full-grown aliens can be a variety of sizes depending on their host. And there's plenty of variety in the Star Wars universe. This Grievous mini was very finicky to put together, especially his tiny little hip joints and ankles. But it is nice that this is made with a plastic that has a lot more flex to it than a resin would. I bent him a number of times where, had he been made of resin, he would have for sure snapped. Overall, it's a really nice sculpt, and it was the perfect pose for this diorama. After the General was together, I assembled the aliens. The box came with 12 minis, but one of them was in a pose that was essentially incompatible with the diorama in this awkward crouching position, so I put him on a base and I left him on my shelf. After these equally finicky aliens were together, it was time to move on to the base. I went with this large PVC pipe because there's room underneath for a battery housing should I choose to use it. This Star Wars Alien crossover isn't the first of its kind. I actually remember seeing this artwork from Guillaume Pongelupi a few years ago. I probably butchered the pronunciation of his name, but it is a cool name. Maybe I'll recreate this again with Vader and some stormtroopers at some point. To give the PVC a solid platform to build on, I welded on a piece of thick styrene using Weld-On 3. This stuff is very potent. It does an excellent job creating a permanent bond between plastics. It works super quick, and then I trimmed off the excess with a hobby blade followed by some nippers and an emery board to finish the job. To build up the landscape on which these aliens will be duking it out, I used some offcuts of XPS foam, which I stacked up and glued together using foam safe superglue. Off camera, I trimmed that to a more circular and then conical shape. And then on camera, I began to define it as a rock spire, starting with a utility knife followed by a hobby blade. Once enough of the pink shawarma had been removed with a knife, I switched to a Dremel and refined the surface even further to a more rocky texture. I then followed that with a blast of hot air from a heat gun to clean up the surface and give it a bit of a shell. It just does that when you heat it up. And then for an even thicker shell, I threw on a coat of matte Mod Podge, which I wet blended on the rocks with a black primer. Once dry, this will be a nice, durable surface that takes paint very well. As I got closer to gluing the figures in place, I realized that all the Xenomorphs' hands were oriented with the thumbs pointing up, like they were about to hug something, rather than pointing toward each other, which would be more conducive to climbing. So I adjusted all of their wrists accordingly. And then before getting too far, I also needed to drill a hole for some wires, because I did decide to add lights after all. Drilled a hole all the way through the base and into the rock that Grievous is standing on. After the King of the Hill had been glued down, I hid the seam around his base and also made some dirt patches on the flat areas using earth effects from AK Interactive. And then it was time to arrange the aliens. It was a bit of a puzzle to arrange these aliens in such a way that optimized their poses but also looked natural. And I kind of built it around two aliens in particular that are being, well, let's just say fruit ninja'd. I didn't want it to be too graphic of a scene, but A little bit of gore is to be expected in a situation like this. The last alien to glue in place was the second of the sliced individuals. Once he was glued in place, the layout of the diorama was done. And I'm really happy with the motion and the cinematic feel that I was able to communicate. I didn't have enough room to put the battery housing on the flat section of the base, so I had to come up with a little solution by making a flat surface I could attach it to using a little block of wood. Once that was in place, I drilled a hole for a switch in the side of the PVC. This will make things a lot easier to get everything wired up later on. Off camera, I installed the switch. I got the wiring connected to the battery housing and then ran those wires all the way through the top. And with that, it was time to start painting. I took the whole thing outside and I painted just the base black with a rattle can, because that sticks to PVC far better than my acrylic primer. But for the rest, that needed to be painted with a brush, I applied a much finer surface with that acrylic primer. After the black, I loaded up the airbrush with purple. And then from here on out, I didn't rinse the airbrush between colors, I just added new colors to help create a gradient. I added first red, then orange and yellow, and finally an ice yellow, which I applied at higher up on the diorama and from a steeper angle. This was to create a nice zenithal lighting that also colored the rocks and the rest of the diorama to give it a consistent lighting across the whole thing. Once I was happy with those base colors, I put the airbrush away, set that aside for now, and I broke out my wet palette, which I loaded up with the primaries, white, ice yellow, and black, and then I began the brushwork. At this point, you may be asking why I didn't paint everything in sub-assembly and then just throw it all together at the end. I asked myself that same question a couple times. There were a couple very hard to reach places and really no good place to rest my hand while I was painting, which made it more difficult. However, I do like the effect of painting it all together like I did. I wanted the Xenomorphs to almost feel like they were part of the landscape because they're kind of a glossy black. I wanted the colors to be represented. And I feel like painting it the way I did at the beginning really helped establish that. Grievous obviously had a completely different look and color scheme to him than the rest of the diorama, but even so, the colors, the base coats of the environment being in the recesses and subtly showing through on parts of him really also helped him feel like he was a part of the scene rather than like he had just been dropped in place. To get the Xenomorphs back to a more appropriate shade while still keeping those colors that I liked so much, I used an enamel pin wash. And for the two guys who were getting sliced and diced, I painted the openings with white followed by a acidic neon green. I used white with a slightly bluish tint to give some specular highlights to those aliens to help them appear a little bit more glossy. And then I finally painted up Grievous's lightsabers. And the last step to tie this whole paint job together was some red and blue ink, which I thinned down and applied from below with the airbrush. I'm really happy with this paint job, and I like the subtlety of the painted on lightsabers. And if this was going to be submitted in the diorama category of a painting competition, I would probably have tried to do some OSL and called it good, but this is Boil Eye Hobby time. I needed to remove those to add some lights. After snipping off the plastic blades, I broke out some LED filaments. I used 2 blue and 2 green, obviously, and then I got to soldering. I found the thinnest wires that I had on hand. I got those connected to the leads on the filaments, and then I protected the connections with some clear heat shrink. And right here you can see just how small these wires were, which made them very hard to work with. But eventually I did get everything soldered up, and I did some cable management by gluing all of them together underneath the cloak. I tested the circuit, I got everything wired up to the batteries, and after that, I called it good. Last week was the art challenge week for February that I host for my patrons. I didn't work the theme into my build as I had intended because of some unexpected mishaps, so I decided to give Final Stands another go. That is the theme of today's diorama, and here are the rest of the final stands that were submitted by my patrons in case you missed them last time. Once again, great job, and a huge thank you to all the patrons who participate in the monthly art challenge. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.